As you know, to the last lecture in this semester series, it is very exciting. It's an honor to welcome Michael Osman today. I hope I'm not being on Monday. Many have suggested that to think conceptually is somehow a concomitant to also think historically. I think last time I heard perhaps somewhat obvious, but also no less profound, was Stephen Fry suggesting that it's basically all history. And in so many ways, what we do, if we are committed to speculating on opportunities in design, we are there to speculate on a future, the only way to do so is to rely on history and to rely on basically those things that put us here. And I think this is obviously where Michael's work is situated, an historian whose contribution then to architecture is also possibly a contribution to what I think is absolutely essential, that is to overcome the compartmentalization of what I think of as his conceptual approaches, conceptual thinking, and on the other hand, theoretical, historical approaches to architecture. And that has, till in so many respects, been given by basically two camps. One that is formalist, and the other one that is historical or critical historicism. And I believe that Michael's work then contributes to basically expand on this space where we see architecture in an expanded view. In fact, you say so at the end of the book, an expanded view of modernist history. And I think it also echoes what I think also reading through Benjamin Butler's book, Formalism and Historicity, an attempt to basically bridge two forms of reading. It's also echoed in the literary theorist Caroline Levine's proposal, where she suggests that we can imagine a new formalist method that overcomes the parsing of formalist and historicist approaches by bringing together the dispersed insights into social and aesthetic forms. And Michael, particularly with this work that he will send to us today, seeks a connection between the infrastructure that undergirds the processes of modernization, the historiography of modernist architecture. Michael is Associate Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA. There he also directs the MA as much as the PhD program in History and Theory of Architecture. Not the least, he's one of the founding members and current chair of Aggregate, which is the architectural history collaborative, a group of people who get together, you said, maybe twice a year, and obviously have exchanges that also, so to speak, runs across the discipline and help us to propagate and see its development. Michael's own PhD was done at MIT, under Mark Sommer. The work that lies underneath this is partly rooted in his PhD dissertation. It involves also archival research, very precious activity, so to speak, meaning that it doesn't necessarily abide by reading books, but really goes into archives and to consult original material to dwell on these deep roots, the very infrastructure that makes architecture possible and that brings architecture into this expanded field where we can understand it's being produced. It's actually embodied by more than the master buildings done by the few master architects, so to speak. But actually we understand that it's also the result of subtle regulations and forms of technology and developments and innovations in these fields. I can take it over here.
It's been a great couple of days. I really enjoyed being here. And it was really, actually, I have to say, it was such a wonderful thing to be able to be here and see Anna's talk in front of you guys, because I never get really that many chances to do that, to watch her, because I have to take care of the kids when she does that sort of thing. So it was really fun. And I'm not sure how you'll square what I presented today with what was presented earlier this week, but maybe that's an interesting point of conversation anyway, because a lot of this work was done, as much as it was done in the PhD by myself. Of course, it had to be dinner conversation. So it'd be interesting to see if you guys see any of the influences of what you saw earlier this week in this work, which surely there is, and I will admit it. But I thought before, and it's been so wonderful to have Johan and Yara as hosts, and I can't wait to continue conversations in the future. So it's really a terrific visit. But I told Johan that I would start today before introducing the research, which now feels a little old, not just a little, and very old to me, because I started it as a PhD student and then defended it in 2008, and then 10 years later it came out as a book. So in a way it's like 13, 14 years old or something like that, this work. Like it's a teenager. An adolescent, it's going to high school. And so before I present it, which I'll do, I thought I should talk a little bit about what it means, for example, to do a PhD, what it means to be a historian in architecture. I hope that that's interesting to you. Yeah? This is also, I was telling Yara, it's also a solicitation, because as the head of a PhD program now, I'm invested in producing more architectural scholars. And I kind of want to make a pitch for it anyway. I think that it's a valuable thing to do. But it's not for everybody, and also not everybody. If there's somebody in the audience who's thinking about it, here I'll talk about it for a few minutes. So I went to architecture school after doing a history of that. So I studied American history, and I thought, this is too isolated of a practice, historical scholarship, to be of any value to anybody. So I thought I need to do something that's more engaged in the world than just writing books. So I went to architecture school, and I wanted to get a master's in architecture, thinking, well, to become an architect, practice in the world means to throw your ideas out from the written page or the drawn page and actually have them in conversation with other people who actually execute these ideas. And I was perhaps right about that on a certain level, but that means that you also kind of short circuit, or in a way redirect all the energy that you once had towards writing things now to drawing things. It's an entirely new language. And I was very thrown off by that. Like, imagine, as many of you here don't have German as your native tongue, presumably. That same feeling, I felt that feeling of not having any real comprehension of architecture as a language, which I needed to learn. Drawing as a language, modern learning as a language. All of these were actually individual languages. I was very put off by that. But what was lucky was that all the while architecture sponsors a scholarly preoccupation. So they invite people who are getting PhDs or have PhDs to come and give lectures or to quiz or seminars. And we'll be doing that seminar tomorrow here. So I hope that you can attend that as well. And I remember thinking to myself, this I can do, but how does this have anything to do with studio? And I'm not sure I know yet, but I'm pretty sure that I went back to doing history with the idea that in fact it was not an internal discourse directed only to other historians, but it was a discourse that actually did cross boundaries in a very similar way to how architecture would have to always cross boundaries between the thoughts of an architect, hopes and ambitions of their client, say, which is one form of collaboration, and then the hopes and ambitions, as it were, of the builder who might actually make a piece of architecture. So it's a form of communication. Now history becomes a kind of, let's say, fourth node, client, architect, builder, historian, and that I actually think is an important, let's say, square that without the historian, I'm not sure what that practice of builder, client, architect really is. I mean, it's practice, and we know that maybe most of the world doesn't have the fourth corner. But I'm insistent that I think that without it, it's really, really hard to know why to do architecture in the first place. What's there? I was thinking about what I was thinking. What is architecture, and what question has to be asked that architecture is an answer for? And I don't think that we know that without history. So I agree, everything is history, but also you can do it without. You just don't know what question you're answering, and it's a bit, that's Corbusier about it. How do you know what to do when you have to ask? The question has to be, the problem has to be correctly stated. Doesn't that make sense? So I think that requires history. And it's clear from the lessons in Rome, if you read that here, for an architecture, that for sure, Corbusier architecture was an answer to a historical question. I would actually argue that architecture is an answer to a historical question. Anyway, with that in mind, I decided to do a PhD, and also that I was very disquieted by the way in which studio felt like a different form of thinking, and I couldn't understand how to incorporate historical thought into. It wasn't taught as precedent, even back in the 90s when I went to school. That was not, it wasn't that kind of formalism anyway. So I went back and did a PhD, and also to kind of prove to myself that I can do architecture through history. That the historical practice was a way of reconstituting architecture and making it what I wanted it to be. So this is the product of a dream about what architecture might have been if I were to be able to describe a profession that I wanted to be a part of. So, you know, if you get to determine something like room temperature as an architect, that's quite an exciting proposition. If you get to determine what the freshness of food is, that's quite an exciting proposition. But architecture doesn't have that function anymore, but it did have that function at one time. And so my historical project, it's a historical project that tries to constitute architecture as a profession that answers those questions. What is the origin of room temperature? Architecture. What makes food fresh? Architecture. So I wanted to be able to answer the question of what architecture is. Historically, we can say that in a specific period, at least, it answered certain questions that we never ask anymore. So that was the project. I don't think I knew it then, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be the project I continue to do. And that's, I think, a project I was sort of, as it were, in sort of Heideggerian prose, summon you, if you're interested in doing it, to come in the path to do that, if it holds sway, as it were. I don't know if you guys are reading. History then should become that operation through which you can constitute and imagine the architecture as you want it to be. So that's what I did. And in order to explain to you what I think I was doing in relationship to architectural history of modernism, I would begin with this icon of modernist architecture, which, at least in the United States, is undeniably modern architecture. It's the Larkin building by Fred Lloyd Wright, undeniably modern architecture. But what makes this building modern? What makes this building architecture? You might ask as well. I'm not going to answer the question of what makes this building architecture. I think that's self-evident. But what makes this building modern is a question that various historians have asked. So Vincent Scully, for example, a historian who actually was my first employer. It was my first job was to teach. I was a teaching assistant for Vincent Scully in his art history class called Modern Architecture. And so he would have said, this is architecture because, and it is modern architecture because when you look at the plan, this is the plan. You are telling me to do the plans. This is what a plan looks like. It's also a plan on the right. Very nice plan. This is the plan on the left, and when Scully looked at this plan, it reminded him of this plan. That's formalism. Formalism is when you look at a plan and you think about another plan. So Vince looked at this plan and thought of this plan, and it happened to both be in Buffalo, and both by the same architect. So they're two plans that he thinks one builds on the other. Of course, it is convenient that this plan of the Darwin Martin house was in fact designed before this plan was designed. So this plan is from 1903 and then this plan is from 1905. So within 2 years, Wright had drawn two plans. And Scully says, look at this plan. This plan has what he says is democratic space because it flows between these piers and interconnects the inside and the outside. It's great, it's beautiful. I mean, you go through there, and he actually says that feeling of liberation you have as space moves between piers and apertures and doors and inside and outside is the feeling of being a part of democracy. That it was the 1960 whatever, 65, I think. People believe whatever they want to believe then. This one, a couple of years later, he said, look, that's the refinement of that architectural idea brought into the sort of, from the domestic realm here. Actually, it turns out that Darwin Martin was a CEO, as it were, or CFO, actually, of the Larkin Corporation. And he then recommended that they hire Wright to do the new so-called administration building for the Larkin Company, which was a soap company, but then ended up becoming a mail order company. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And he says, look, you see the flowing space between the piers, it's the growth of an architectural idea, the maturity of a style. And Scully also quotes Wright as saying that this is how things happen. I'm, by the way, going to go really slowly, and if I lose you and I see you guys start to nod off, I'll speed up. I'm doing this extemporaneously because, well, I don't know. There's another architect in 1965, studies the same building, amazingly enough. Rainer Badham, British architect, never met the guy, quite brilliant, and I would say more persuasive in many ways than Scully because he doesn't have all the rhetoric in the way that Scully does. He, I think, is very keen. He deals with the more technical side of architecture. He says, well, what makes this building modern is not the democracy of the plan, which is just basically like a metaphor, as it were. This is what makes this building modern are the sort of technicalities. And here he actually doesn't draw this. That's the metric. It's his wife who draws it. Mary Benham, who's still alive. I think she was, at least when I needed to get the rights for this drawing for my book, and I had to pay a lot of money to her in British pounds. Oh, no, she didn't want it in British pounds. She wanted it in dollars. Which cost me extra money, so to send dollars anyway. So Mary makes explicit, as it were, the cut through one of the piers, one of the so-called democratic pieces of the architecture, and shows, in fact, that it's not just architecture, it's infrastructure, and that what's going through this pier, what's moving up and down and through it, is air. And in fact, it happens to be one of these really early examples of a kind of forced air interior. And so Banham concludes that the Larkin building is modern because of the technical determination of these piers. So in fact, drawing it as it is, an axonometric drawing, it really flattens out the spatiality that Scully was interested in talking about the fluidity of the interior, right? He's talking about air, but he's not talking about democracy, he's talking about air as a technical substance and no longer as a metaphor for, let's say, democracy. Then you look at the administration building. I'm not the first to observe this. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright, in his own autobiography, says the reason we needed to do this very thing of adding the forced air system into the pier is because if you look at where the administration building is located in Buffalo, it's in fact an enormously polluted area. And so you needed to enclose in a hermetically sealed building the people who worked there, and for their own safety, you needed to produce this forced air conditioning system. It's kind of proto-conditioning anyway. So you see this sort of smoke in the background, and this is in fact all the warehouses owned by the Larkin building, but Larkin Corporation, from which they send various wares and people who buy, let's say, a brush for their hair, or I don't know, any commodity, any household commodity. So this is the administration building, actually, in which not only does the office staff work, but also where all of the files of all of the clients who've ordered all of the household objects are stored. All of the client files are stored in vertical drawers, which are very early vertical filing systems, actually. It's very early in the history of the vertical file. It's maybe right at the beginning of the history of the vertical file. Actually, my colleague, Zainab Alexander, has written a beautiful essay about this building, not just as a machine for breathing, but also as a machine for accounting. Beautiful essay about that. And what I think is interesting is to think about it as in both a machine for breathing, a machine for accounting, and as a piece of architecture. 3, Scully, Banham, Alexander. Like, what if you combine all 3 of those things? What is that? What kind of architectural history is that? That's the architecture I wanted to be a part of. Right? I didn't want to be Frank Lloyd Wright. That was not possible anymore. But I did want the architecture that I would contribute to the world to be something that might imagine new forms of accounting, imagine new forms of life, literally air that you breathe, and new form, new architectural spatial form. All 3 of those things would be a great architectural profession anyway. And is that no longer possible? Certainly in my architectural upbringing, form was privileged. And then maybe the technicalities of air down here. And then for sure, way down here was level stacking file cabinets. But I thought it would be really great to make, and this is what I'm trying to explain, my book about that triangle, about how architecture is always about those three things: administration, life, and form. And I think every example of the things that I study in my book have those elements, at least one, if not two of those. And oftentimes it's just life and administration. And the form seems trivial, but it's not, right? Because if you take life and administration and you put them together, you'll always find form. It's just not necessarily the form you expect. It's not always canonical modernist architecture. This is what I mean by expanding the canon, right? Because how do we know what's important until we rewrite the history of modernism from the point of view of administration and life? Now we have a new canon. This may be one example, but I think it's really important. This is just to show you that, in fact, this democratic interior was used by office managers for, and as a perfect architectural example of the architecture they hoped architects would develop for the new managerial problems of, let's say, office work. So here's the first chapter of the book, and this really frustrated my advisor, which is I said, okay, we have to start with something that is being regulated, because my word, as you can see from of all these words, the only word you really need to know that I've kind of been trying to contribute to architectural discourse is this one, regulation. Because I think if you take life and administration and you bring them together, the word that binds them together is regulation. And then I thought, and it didn't start here, but this is where the story starts anyway, that if you could find an instrument that administers life, what would it be? We need to find some kind of a sensing mechanism, something that could tell what in architecture at least, as more and more people are in here and we heat this room, we open the door in order to change the temperature, but as we collectively heat this room to about 98 degrees Fahrenheit or so, right? We could probably, if we just sat in here all night, we could probably heat it to about 90. Did some exercise. But what was the instrument, I asked, that helped, that already does, I don't see one in here anyway. I don't see thermostat. But there should be one in here that would then say, if it were too cold, that would turn these radiators on when we need them. And so the thermostat became for me the first administration of life, the first example of a way to bring those two questions together with architecture. But I wasn't yet sure what that architecture was going to look like. All I knew is that at some point people started sticking thermostats on the wall, and I wanted to know when and why. So this is, by the way, the inventor of the thermostat. His name was Andrew Ure, Ure. I think that's how you say it. He's Scottish. He's from Glasgow. And the thing that people, well, just to be clear, the thing that people hung these things on the wall, but it wasn't quite hanging things on the wall really at the beginning, was that they were mostly doing it for industrial purposes. So this happens to be a vat in which you would want to keep the liquid dye at a specific temperature so that you could maintain the same temperature. Let's say you want to dye your shirt black. You don't want the temperature to go too low because it'll take longer, or too high because it might change the color, right? So you would, for consistency's sake, to regulate the color black of your shirt, you would want the same temperature of that vat. Same would go for, let's say, brewing beer or something. You want it to be a consistent low temperature, for example. And these are actually like for a factory where they wanted to bring in cold and hot air. This is actually the thermostatic mechanism, which is actually two pieces of metal that are riveted at the top and at the bottom, and they're made out of two different metals, which is to say one is zinc, I believe, and one is iron, I think. And when one expands, the other contracts, and so forth like that. So it produces a movement, a movement which is sensing the differences in temperature in the interior, and then resulting in the movement, for example, of this, what he calls a stopcock, which then opens, as you can see, through these thermostatic, what he calls bimetal strips, which then open and close the stopcock. The same bimetal strip would open and close this vat of liquid. Anyway, what weirdly enough, for all of the industrial practical purposes that this guy invented this mechanism for, it wasn't really applied to an architectural interior successfully, not a factory, not anything, until it really finds the single-family American home. Strangely enough, actually, although the thing is developed in Britain, it isn't until a whole discourse around domestic economy emerges in the mid-19th century in the United States. Here's another drawing by Mary Danham of the so-called American Woman's House. It isn't really until the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, that they find how to apply that thermostatic mechanism to a piece of architecture. And the reason that it's in America and not in Britain is that the United States is an early adopter of the electrification of the interior of the home. So it's because of Thomas Edison and the capacity to create an interior network that the thermostat actually becomes a device that becomes integrated into an architectural interior and can control the interior. And it fulfills the demands of a very particular person who lives in that house. And that's not the father, and it's not the kids. It's the mother. The mother is the engineer, as it were, of the American interior conditioning, conditioning of the American household interior. And she renames herself from housekeeper to household manager. So the thermostat becomes the tool by which the household manager, the mother, integrates administration and life. And you see her hand here, and maybe I should read this passage because it was actually nicely kind of written partly by my wife, so I should. She's such a great writer, by the way, isn't she? So this is an advertisement for the Minneapolis Heat Regulator Company from 1906. And it provides, this is partly by me, but partly by her, provides evidence that the disparate cultural interests regarding technology, health, economy, and society could be assembled into a single gesture. The first line of text in the advertisement advises its readers that sanitary heating is impossible without, quote, an automatic heat regulator to maintain a uniform temperature. Uniform or even temperature was described as desirable for both comfort and health. The word sanitary implies that the machinery would maintain a clean environment for a hygienic home. And the advertisement explains that the instrument can then contribute to saving on coal bills and to balancing the household's finances. Administration. The photograph used to illustrate the advertisement shows a female hand reaching toward a knob affixed to the bottom of the thermostat. Both the hand and the instrument having been extracted from their context, presumably a home, surrounded instead with text, and the thermostat hangs then as the interface between the circuitry of a home, which could belong to anyone, and the hand, or anyone can own a middle-class home, and the hand of an anonymous household manager whose ring finger, strangely on the right hand, not the left, boasts engagement and wedding bands, indicating both class and social position within the family. And below the thermostat, the words adjust here, you see them, establish the purpose of her gesture, and under her wrist, this is definitely the part she wrote, the words it's automatic refer to the exchange between her will and the instrument's dial. The thought of fixing the temperature required no labor beyond turning the knob. It's almost by reflex then that the mechanisms of the house respond to the movement of the manicured finger. The thermometer above measures the temperature in the room just below 70. The knob is also at 70, implying the machine has already acted upon the household manager's desire. Perhaps we are then watching the hand slowly withdraw from the instrument after all the machines have already done their work. So that's the end of chapter 1. Nicely written by Untitled, for which I take credit. But I gave her acknowledgement. Anyway, this is the beginning of the second chapter, which takes that thermostatic mechanism and shows it actually achieving an industrial purpose, again in the United States. This is many thermostats are actually operating on this mechanism, which is here, as you can see perhaps, regulating the movement of ammonia as it expands from a liquid to a gas. When that happens, that expansion, it's an adiabatic. Adiabatic is in thermodynamics is a heat it removes heat from its environment through basically the sublimation of this material as it goes from liquid to gas. And so that happens in these coils, and these coils then, as you might imagine, actually help cool the interior. This is before we had anything like air conditioning. Help cool the interior of a building. And this is actually the building in which it was applied to in maybe the most monumental way. It's in Chicago. It's designed by a famous architect, so I was quite pleased. So whereas here I have no form, really, perhaps you can call this architectural form, but it's really barely that. By the second chapter of the book, you really get something that you might call architecture. In fact, this is when somebody who might be a formalist might actually say, well, why don't you start here? Right? Kind of did anyway, but you have to start somewhere else in order to get to this point, which is to say, the administration of life happens here no longer at the scale of the family, but at the scale of the city. Because what is happening in Chicago at this moment is that a whole bunch of people are getting together and realizing that if they can store perishable produce in a building for an extended period of time, they can begin to speculate on its price. So this is called futures trading. And if you then, let's say, have a bushel of onions and you don't want to sell them, you hold them from the market, and you can then put out a kind of speculative receipt. It's called it's called a futures contract because it's for future delivery. You can begin to speculate, will the onions go up in price or go down in price? And so in this building, which you can see is called the Cold Storage Exchange, it's because this became the Chicago Cold Storage Exchange, it's because this facility, this cold storage facility, is actually a place in which you could store and exchange the commodities that you had stored. So begin to, let's say, trade bushels of onions for pork bellies. This becomes the basis for commodity exchange, and basically the largest speculative market in Chicago called the mercantile exchange. It's the largest speculative market in the world, actually. I wanted to show in this chapter that monumental system, which by the way failed, despite architectural form, not because of art. I want it to be very clear. I'm not indicting architecture as the reason for this failure. Rather, architecture and its beautiful monumentalization of this piece of technology and infrastructure is an amazing way of getting this thing off the ground. But it wasn't the right solution to this technological problem of administering life. As a matter of fact, if you want to find the right solution, you have to look elsewhere to smaller markets, specifically in Boston. And this company, the Quincy Market Cold Storage Company, actually, weirdly enough, becomes the largest cold storage company in the world in 1895, when they convert from this tiny little ice-cooled storage facility. This was actually where they harvested ice and stuck it in an ice loft, and as the ice melted, it actually cooled the warehouse space beneath it. So here, actually, the cooling mechanism is held in the basement and cools through those coils that we saw here, the rest of the building. Here, the ice is held up top and cools the building from top to bottom. So it's an interesting inversion. But what actually makes this company so successful is that they invest in this little space back here, which again doesn't have many. This, by the way, is also quite an ugly kind of wonky building. But they invest in what they find to be the largest refrigerating machine ever built. What this machine does is ostensibly the same thing that this machine does, but instead of cooling immediately the environment by the adiabatic reaction of taking liquid ammonia and converting it to gas, it takes that conversion and cools down brine, salt water, which can go below freezing, as you know, right? I'm relying on your chemistry knowledge. So you move the brine through the city, actually, and you can begin conducting, as you can see here, not just the cooling of the warehouse facilities here, but a warehouse facility here, a warehouse facility here. In fact, the meat market of Boston becomes cooled by the brine that's cooled at the facility here. So it becomes not just a regulating infrastructure for the architecture, but a regulating infrastructure for the entire market district. So instead of monumental architectural reform, the solution to this problem was an infrastructure of a public amenity. That is to say, what you're looking at is the administration of life through the invention of a new public utility. Coal, at the end of the 19th century, was like a telephone or, electricity. It was one among a set of public utilities. And the way in which they actually regulated the temperature all over the Marcus district of Boston, I found really fascinating, because it was a hybrid of a thermometer and a telephone. This is actually a telephone, and this is the end of an electrode, and these little copper studs here are all connected, as you can see, to wires that then follow the brine pipes around the market district. And as they arrive in a warehouse 2 or 3 blocks away, they send a signal back, an electrical signal back to one of these things. And as you listen to this, you can put your ear, actually here, to the end of the telephone, and you connect this electrode to this electrode. You look at this dial, and it's telling you if the temperature is 0 degrees Fahrenheit, very, very cold, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 0 degrees Celsius, or higher than that, perhaps you want higher than that, most likely will. And so in a way, this infrastructure helps you regulate an entire city's worth of temperatures. So how do you know what the temperature is far away? You listen to the tone, and as you turn a dial on this thing, which is the dial that's moving the temperature from, let's say, 0 to 32, if you hear a tone, you hear a tone, you hear a tone, in the moment the tone stops, that's the temperature of that distant location. So you know, in other words, you get information from silence, which I think is an incredible fact, right? So here's, as it were, architecture getting wrapped up into a whole system of senses, right? Your cold, your auditory senses, and all of them are being used to mobilize, let's say, this speculative market. Okay, so at that point, the book more or less takes a very hard right turn. That is, if you're to get this far in the book anyway. It's like, I think you're about 100 pages in. This second half of the book, I would say, becomes more formalistic. buildings, but representations. And not all those representations are, and presuming, have anything to do with making a building. They might just be a representation of an idea, or the representation, I don't know what you represent. But I was very interested in how regulation is something that needed to become represented. And my thought was that perhaps the science of regulation, the science of ecology, was the way in which you could begin to understand how regulation was represented. Was it represented through laboratory practices? Was it represented through museum practices? My answer actually is both. So actually ecology as a modern science was invented in this building where actually I studied as an undergraduate. This is the botany wing at the University of Chicago. And you know, the ecologists were quite frustrated with botanists as they were in the 19th century who looked at plants and observed them, let's say, in a greenhouse. And they said, no, you need to observe how plants interact with their environment. This is why ecologists are theorists of regulation, because what they're saying is, we're not just interested in life, but how life administers itself in relationship to its environment, right? So this is again the administration of life. And now it's a scientific representation of the administration of life, not the architectural embodiment of that, right? So now I'm looking at how scientists use architecture to help themselves represent the regulatory mechanisms of life. And so this is actually a photograph that was taken by one of those scientists, a guy called Henry Chandler Coles, who took a photograph of a dune, and this is what he liked to study. Why? Because dunes actually are very good examples of the relationship between an organism and its environment, because the organism is a grass, and where grass grows among dunes, that is where sand gets trapped. And so he calls these things embryological dunes. Why? Because when sand grows and traps, when grass grows and traps sand, it becomes it allows for another rhizome of the sand, of the grass plant to grow, and then more and more grass can grow. And this is what ostensibly helps the dune landscape grow, is grass. And then as that dune landscape grows, it can sponsor more and more life, which is to say more and more diverse life. And he calls these things that exist on, you see this is also a dune that has little plants, and in fact trees growing out of it, not just grasses, which is what, so he calls this a developed dune. And then he says, but the thing about what's so great about studying dunes is that they move, because as the sand moves from one place to another, for sometimes an entire developed ecosystem, as it were, here, will just be completely destroyed by the movement of the dune. So he thought this is a fascinating place to study Coles and Chandler Coles, because in photographs you could capture immediately the kind of drama of this regulatory system, where plants grow in relationship to their environment and die in relationship to their environment, and then regrow, as it were, to produce new life. He called this a dune. And the moment at which I realized this did interface with architecture was when I found out that, in fact, Henry Chandler Coles had become one of the scientific governors of the Chicago Academy of Sciences back in the 19-teens. And he proposed, in fact, that the Academy would develop, from the photographs that he'd taken for his dissertation project in 1890, that they could be applied as a public image of ecology in order to develop a knowledge of the way in which the Chicago region's natural history came into being. So, in fact, architecture and photography became a useful medium through which ecology could represent its form of knowledge to a public audience. And in fact, this is a set of photographs that were developed, they were developed at 11 feet high. They were photographs of the dune landscape developed, this, by the way, this from here to about, I'd say here, is a kind of 11-foot high backdrop. panorama of the entire Chicago region, from the dunescape, as you can see here, to the so-called Calumet region here, which is more of a kind of marshy area. And it was one continuous horizon line that bound the Chicago region, and he created an 11-foot high. Why 11 feet? Do you know, do you know standard measurements? What's half of 11? It's 5.5, right? The average adult human's eye is at 5.5 feet, right? Thereabout. And so the horizon line had to be at the average interior occupant's eye level so that you could produce a completely artificial horizon line on the interior. And this wrapped 360 degrees. And you would enter actually the museum from the middle and then be surrounded by the Chicago region on all sides. And this became a public image of ecology, and very quickly thereafter, this is a photograph of those exhibitions from 1916, and this is a photograph of the Dune landscape in 1916, which was completely undergoing a radical transformation from when Cole studied it as a PhD student of botany. What was happening since 1908 was that the corporation U.S. Steel had developed the world's largest steel manufacturer on the same Dune landscape. And so the images that Coles was producing, this is an important lesson I also kind of wanted to sort of tell of architecture, was that the image and the assemblage of this giant panoramic image of the Chicago region was a political tool by which to mobilize against the unregulated enterprise of American capitalism. So in fact, architecture became a political tool through which scientists, ecologists, could make a compelling public case for preserving the dunes from the unbridled and unregulated interests of American capitalists. So it's, for me, a very important moment in the book where what was fundamental to the political economy of the home or of the American capitalist was also, architecture could also be used as a way to resist the unbridled greed of capitalism against, let's say, the conservation of nature. So this is something that I really wanted to talk about. At the same time, I didn't want to undermine the fact that ecologists actually continue to use thermostats and cold storage actually as ways of performing their experiments, so that the scientific laboratory actually profited from all of the industrialized uses of the regulatory apparatus that I studied. So this chapter actually weirdly bridges between the representational function of architecture and its technical function. Again, this is connecting what you might call form, in this case, representation, to technology. This is just an image, for example, of what the zoologist Victor Shelford thought his mentor, Henry Chandler Coles, was a botanist, would have imagined as a kind of unadulterated view of the ecological landscape, where of the dunes, for example, where you had like nuts, fruit, leaves, twigs, and bark, and all these animals that lived off of the resources. And this is actually how Shelford redrew that after the sort of, surely after the sort of intrusion of this giant corporation within the dune landscape. This is an idea about how man always imposes himself on the land, making it into a standing reserve, as it were. Shelford was a proto-Hungarian. Actually, it's interesting because this essay was written in 1935, exactly at the same time as the question concerning technology. Interesting, right? Ecological theory, and I'd never thought about it. Ecological theory and Heidegger kind of emerged around the same time. So here, okay, so man creates this, what he calls ring of control, and this is the domestic interior here, which is obviously technological, and this is the sort of wild outside here, and there are these, let's say, conversations between inside and outside of man's technological control. But everything is determined by this hierarchical relationship, as it were, the gested of the relationship inside and outside. And this becomes a very important diagrammatic description of an ecological system, one that is then applied by Chicago sociologists to the city of Chicago as an ecology of the city, where they understand the loop as in an ideal situation, as this sort of site of the resources, and then the various loops, as it were, around the loop, circles as a kind of, as they called it, urban succession, one which then you could move from the sort of center of the resources out to the perimeter. And what they wanted to show here in this diagram, interestingly enough, was that Chicago was this model applied in actuality, and that what was happening, unfortunately, to these perfect zones, as you moved from one zone to the next zone to the next zone, were being interrupted by an unfortunate visitor. In a way, you might call all of these lines as certain kinds of parasites. The raccoon comes and eats your maize, which should be for your corn, for your horses, but it ends up being eaten by the. So this is, as you can see, a very racialized idea about the sort of what they call as a kind of disruptive or disorderly force of disorganization, which they call the black hole. You know why it's called black hole. Because it's the migration of African Americans from the American South into the city of Chicago who live here, and they see this as the source of crime and disorganization of the city. Deeply racist. So just to say, politicized, but also not always politically correct. So the last portion of the book takes on this problem, how to represent regulation, and brings it back to industry where we started. Remember that the very first chapter says that the thermostat is a thing that is a way of kind of administering things within the kind of technological environment of the factory. I wanted to ask the question, well then, if it wasn't the thermostat that set the factory into order, what was it? And what I realized is that it was a whole new administrative regime of paperwork. That in fact, what the factory what was developed for the factory especially under the watchful eye of Frederick Winslow Taylor. I don't know if you've ever heard of a movement called Taylorism, Taylorization, where factory work was made rational by a system that he called the planning department. And this is actually a picture of the planning department which was installed in the Tabor manufacturing company in Philadelphia. This is actually a diagram of another planning department, actually, in another Philadelphia machine shop. So what's happening, actually, you can see through this window, the clerk is transferring information from this planning department to the machine shop. The machine shop is then not pictured here. This is the machine shop described in diagrammatic form here. What used to happen was that the parts of the machines that needed to be built in the shop would be drafted in a drafting room and would be transferred directly to the shop through the hands of the foreman, or some number of foremen, who would then divide the labor among the laborers. What Taylor wanted to do was interrupt that flow with a new bureaucracy, which he called the planning department. And in that planning department, they would plan the day's work. And so you get a route clerk who actually decided what were the different routes by which a part would develop. So you would actually have to sort of plan the part as it developed from its most basic elementary form into its most developed form. And in order to do that, you needed to produce a set of instructions, set the rate of the work that needed to happen, and the order of work in which it needed to happen, and then send that information to a production clerk who then sent drawings about sheets and time cards to the shop in order to deliver that, let's say, information. What I think is so fascinating about this is that this is actually a feedback loop, what you might call a black box. And what's happening is that the shop is then sending these information, this information, back through here so that the clerks can then rejigger the work for the day in order to make sure that they get the work done in the most efficient and most with the most command and control that they possibly can. So it's really an early cybernetics system. So just to show you a little bit more detail, what happens is that the planning department sends its information out to the clerks who then sit in the machine shop. And notice that the machine shop is not pictured in any of this stuff, but then they send the information to various members of the crew or various places in the machine shop. And then the information that they get intersects with any number of machines. So whether it's a drill press or a gear cutter or a planer or a lathe or a boring mill, and then the information intersects with a machine and some work has to happen. That's where X. And then I found it very interesting as a formalist, what it meant for information and machines to intersect and create a grid. But as I did more research on this, I realized that the machine shop was a very small part of Taylor's interests. What Taylor actually was interested in doing was creating a new role for management that would create a space for thinking about production in relationship to what we might call the economy. So what's on the left side of this diagram is what they call debtors or creditors. Debtors or customers and creditors. So this is what you might call simple supply and demand. So debtors, or customers, are demand. Creditors are supply, like what materials you might need to build a machine. And so if there's money which you're spending here and money which you're getting here, the planning department, which sits in relationship to that, is always trying to create a relationship of supply and demand through the accommodation of the amount of output that's happening through the shop. So what I realized is that this is kind of a thermostat, right? That the machine shop could just produce infinite. But better, what they realized was that the machine shop could slow down when the economy was weak and produce less, and speed up when the economy was strong and produce more. So that the planning department became a kind of thermostatic mechanism of paperwork that could regulate, as it were, again, administer the life of the machine shop. I thought that was fascinating. And here, what I'm really fascinated by is the fact that this diagram, to me, looked like architecture. It looked like the way in which we began to think about the flow of people and the flow of knowledge and the flow of information to a building. And I actually thought it was really important to think about flow charts, which became an early modernist representational technique of diagramming buildings in order to make them functional. So that was a thing there. And I realized that as much as that was the sort of architectural legacy of these diagrams, it shouldn't have escaped us that architects use these kinds of diagrams in order to organize their own offices. So here's a diagram of an architectural office. It uses the same logic of a kind of thermostatic mechanism for regulating the work of an office. So here the shop is the drafting department where the sort of could be producing at any efficiency, but all of these other members of the architectural office who were clerical laborers would actually regulate the amount and tasks of the drafting department. So last night I showed this drawing, this photograph by Isa Gropius, which is a very European view of what architectural modernism in the United States might look like, the architectural modernism industrial buildings. But I really wanted to show last night too, but I didn't have time then, and I'll show you, is that Albert Kahn, who designed this beautiful building, which is actually the last plant factory of the Ford Motor Company, had designed this building inside this office. So it wasn't Albert Kahn, it was Albert Kahn's offices that designed this building. And what's really fascinating about the interior of his office was that, of course, it was regulated through this system for regulating the labor of the office. And how did they send the information and regulate the labor of the drafting department? This is the drafting department of Kahn's offices. Well, it was through the telephone. And you can see that, in fact, there's many things to be looked at here, but that there are these incredible wires, not just sprinklers, but wires that are wiring this whole place to one and integrating it into a kind of giant system of automated infrastructure. And through those wires, the information that the supervising architect is collecting is being transmitted in order to produce a plan of work for the day. In other words, I think instead of thinking of architectural modernism always through the forms, let's say, that Isa Gropius is documenting in this photograph of Kahn's product, that the process of producing architecture was also going through its own form of modernism. So this is fundamentally how I wanted to redefine architectural modernism, was not only to look at the architectural form that resulted from the offices, but also the way in which the office practiced in order to produce that modernist architecture, so that the office practices themselves are considered to be modern. And this incredible drawing that found in the Kahn archives, where you can begin to see, for example, I'll just zoom in on the key here, all the symbols that were used here. So you have base plugs and fan plugs, and of course to cool you down when it's too hot, telephones, switches, a 3-point switch, a ceiling light, a bracket light, a telephone outlet, a floor plug for the telephone, a wall fan plug, a vent, the conduit. There's conduit everywhere, right? Which then is for all of the things. And then an intercommunicating telephone, and an intercommunicating, what does that even say? Extension. And here, see, our call buzzers. Call buzzer. That what's happening at the beginning of the 20th century is that the entire architectural office is becoming wired in order to transmit the information of the workflow of the architect, in order to regulate architecture as labor. So if we begin to rethink architectural modernism, not only through its form, but the administration of life, we also have to think of the life of the architect as something that needs to be administered. Right? So the final convolution, as it were, of this book, this is really where it ends, is that maybe architecture became modern through its labor practices. Maybe that's also part of the story. And so I think that's the end of it.
Questions? Yeah, please.
I'm glad I sat.
One thing that strikes me is there was a kind of, I don't know if it was a fan, but it was intense interest at one point, certain cans, and the work of Benjamin Batten, Kelly Easton. It also concerns very much an infrastructure.
Yep.
So that sort of the hypothesis of the infrastructure that profoundly affects the space you see your work as a form of a historical. Is it? Yeah.
Well, Keller was a teacher of mine when I was doing my master's, and I think she was trying to figure out what architectural practice she wanted to do in order to engage infrastructure. And I was very impressed with that ambition, but not convinced 100% that architecture was the medium to deal with it. That isn't to say that architecture wasn't going to interface with infrastructure, but that you would need to reconfigure architecture first in order to understand how to teach a new architectural pedagogy where you saw architecture as always already infrastructure. So the answer to your question is very autobiographical, which is that not only did I believe Keller's project, I believed in it so much that I wanted to deliver a new theoretical base from which you could begin to think about a new pedagogy for architecture. Because if architecture had so relied on the Bauhaus model of kind of Folia, like fundamental knowledge about form and color, right? I thought maybe if you created a new Folia of architecture as infrastructure, what would that mean, right? What would your fundamental knowledge would it be to study a thermostat? I don't know, maybe. Would it be to study ductwork? Sprinkler system, lighting system? Probably. You would probably need to start through all of those systems. The building code? Sure.
There's also, pass it over to something step out for I also think of OMA, the work being driven by basically, and I think Kunas himself at one point said that the greatest invention now, which is Aggregate. There was Tate modern proposal they had, which is entirely infrastructure. There's only escalators, lifts, and whatnot. So there's a fascinating fundamental aspect. It seems to reverberate both the contemporary places.
Yep.
I'm also, in so many ways, struck with this possibility of relating it not only to architectural form literally, which you make a case of for begin but also taking the premises of the work of physics. It seems to me to be an attempt that sort of like doing some of these things, and these that it's successful and not to be another discussion perhaps.
I'm not sure it's another discussion. I would really like, before you take your call, I'd like to answer. So, first of all, if I had to pick between Ram and Kohlhaas, I would for sure pick Ome. I would pick Ome almost over anything, but I still have a problem with it. And I still have a problem with it for the same reason I have a problem with Ram, which is that infrastructure in both cases is being used as a metaphor and not being taken literally enough. Which is to say that infrastructure becomes the site for design. And I'm not sure I'm on board with that. Because I still believe in form. So I still believe there's a power to form. And then to resign to infrastructure, to resign form to infrastructure, is a collapse of uncomfortability.
So equally uncomfortable with, for instance, uncomfortable.
No, well, this probably is the most absurd example of infrastructure becoming form, but not as a metaphor, but as a display of absurdity. And therefore, when I was a kid, I remember going there and saying, my mom said, why do you think they put all the pipes on the outside? Because they're beautiful. That's an absurd answer. But that's an absurd answer. I still believe that there should be form. And I would say that I like Kohlhaas when it's not the elevator only, right? My preference is for the buildings that truly are beautiful. That then, for example, I think in Seattle, I haven't been yet, but it's a beautiful building where the infrastructural idea services and amplifies the beauty of the building, and they become complementary to one another. So this I think of as a heightened form of infrastructural formal thinking, where they're running in parallel and concert with one another. I have a very big problem where one becomes the served and the served. I just don't like the idea that why wouldn't you be able to bring them to parity? So that form remains form and service remains service, and doesn't serve the form, but they reinforce one another or produce an architectural idea. I think that class, if you watch the sort of Charlie Rose interviews, he's always saying the same thing. I wish, he says, I wish all our work was as beautiful to everyone as it appears to me. Right? And I thought to myself, that's quite an honest statement, because he recognizes that not all of his work is actually received as beautiful. But he thinks it all is, right? Like all our kids, I don't have an ugly child. Both my children are beautiful. I'm kidding. It doesn't matter how they look. I think of Cole as thinking about the buildings that way, right? But I admire the fact that he can recognize that sometimes the relationship of beauty to infrastructure appears to our eyes as one becoming, let's say, overbearing over the other, right? Or we can no longer see the beauty of form because all we can see is the infrastructure.
In contemporary setting, I think there are two sort of immediate thoughts or questions. So one, maybe you could even speculate on how basically lessons looks, but an interest in involvement with infrastructure, it's not, I wouldn't expect anything concrete, but how could it possibly stimulate our imagination? Stimulate our imagination in producing architecture for tomorrow.
I can't imagine it not. I find the thematization of it as problematic. So when you have a studio that's about self-driving cars, it's an automatic failure. In my opinion, it's an automatic failure. Or you have a studio about fulfillment centers or data centers, automatic failure. Because already you've resigned to having a metaphor about infrastructure, where infrastructure serves formal purposes. Already you have an inequality. And I think, therefore, you should come to a project because the project is appropriate for culture, and then find the infrastructure and develop it through your imagination. And so I don't think fulfillment centers are appropriate. They're not cultural objects. They're infrastructural objects. And they will never deliver form. So drop it there. That's not interesting for architecture. It's interesting, but it's not interesting. I don't like those reviews because I find them to be, I can't even tell you how many times I've sat on that fulfillment center review. And every single one of them is a failure. Every single one of them. From the beginning. It's a bad brief, stop. Same with data centers. So I think you have to think beyond infrastructure to get to architecture. You need form. You need culture. You need something that isn't just totally service. So, and I don't like, a visitor center to a fulfillment center. That's even worse. Okay. Visitor center, Jesus Christ. I love to say that. But yeah, so those are really good questions. I'm so satisfied to see that. What about you guys?
So where do you think the agency of architect lies? As these new systems kind of plug into the drawing, is the architect's agency kind of alienated from the drawing?
No. I don't think that. I think, one, the question of agency is already a question of victimhood. Right? So to seek out agency means you haven't got any. So don't ask that question. I think we should admit that architecture has existed for thousands of years and will continue to exist for thousands of more years. It won't go away. And once you think that, you don't have to worry about agency. There will always be architecture. Just do the architecture with a point of view that takes more seriously your intelligence as an intelligence not confined to one or another discipline. Right? That your intelligence is precocious and undisciplined. And that you can then address any project with that intelligence, because what an architect is meant to do is bring intelligence to your environment. That's it. And there will always be architectural commissions. Don't worry about it. They're not going away. There aren't fewer architects. It's amazing. Right? One of the things I love about this field is that it's always existed as long as we've had books. There are books on architecture. You know, like, think about this guy Poggio. You know him? He was a guy who was hanging out in a monastery in Switzerland in the mountains, and he's sort of an elite reader of Latin, and he comes across a book in St. Gall Monastery, and he said, "Oh, this is a book about architecture." And it turns out it's Vitruvius. This is like 1,400 years after the damn thing was written. 1,300 years after the damn thing. And he's like, "We should publish this." It's amazing to me to think that architecture ever didn't exist, right? And imagine Vitruvius, who's like, I don't know how quite you would say this in Latin, but they say in Greek. Like, really? So it wasn't like Vitruvius started architecture discourse. He was translating from Greek, Or like Anna is showing us buildings, as it were, from 4000 BC. And only now, 6,000 years later, is anybody writing an architectural treatise about that. That's so crazy! She's like Poggio. She's in Toulouse, right? She should be here in a minute now. But she's in Toulouse looking at an archive of somebody who photographed these damn things in order to begin to sort of reveal that they are also part of this discourse. Thank God it's not going away. And it's not going away as long as we continue to remind ourselves we're doing it anyway. And people are going to continue to pay us to do it. It's no problem. It's a joke. I really wish this question would go away. It's, I'm Jewish. And a bunch of Germans up. And in my culture, as much as we have, the question of agency is huge, right? There's a political question. Does blue bother you? Would you prefer being white? No. You prefer blue? Oh, the haze. That's nice. And I think it's an interesting discourse. This is when Heidegger turns into an anti-Semite. It's partly because, probably always already was, it's partly because of the problem of that victimizing politics, right? I don't think that it's, or let's just say a minoritarian politics. I don't think that it's a bad politics. It's a bad politics for architecture, because there's nothing minoritarian about architecture, right? It's such a powerful field that's continued to produce discourse and knowledge for thousands of years. So it's an inappropriate political disposition, right? And this is what I think Keller taught me very well, actually. It's like, stop talking about a lack of agency, because you're always already That's a great question.
Thank you.
Even though I sort of insulted you in your end. But I can insult others. No, I'm not. I wasn't insulting. You probably.
Yeah.
I just don't like that question. It's like, good, yeah, good, yeah. Go.
I was just curious, in the end, you said that maybe modernism, that's a labor practices.
Yep.
And once we consider practices, well, of course I don't know enough about them, but practices in finance,
Yep.
medicine,
Yep.
legal practices, and then we can consider architecture and let's say journalism. Could you maybe elaborate on what you might think of practices that do not, because obviously such labor practices, the formalization of platforms or any other network, what's the word for the network of how you pass on information within an architecture office, obviously did not go across the world.
Oh, yeah.
But
Not everywhere.
But the aesthetic did, and the formal logic or formal organization. How did you could you maybe?
It's a really appropriate question. If what you're asking is, if I may restate your question, what moves if labor practices become the new ground for defining modernism as a historiographical thought? I'll say it again. If modernism needs to be given a narrative, and you're moving that narrative from form to labor, how does that move? Because we understand how form moves, right? But we don't necessarily understand how labor moves. I think that question has a political answer. And I think the reason we don't know how labor moves is because we are told not to know. And politics, which is to say people in charge, don't want us to know. Because that's where you get to determine.
There's this.
Yeah.
That's why I mentioned the
It's
fact
great.
that there
It's a great question.
among formal disciplines.
Yeah.
To me, there seems to be two sides. There's finance, medicine,
Yeah.
where the financial instrument moves from Wall Street to Bangalore.
Yeah.
But the architectural labor practice or the architectural instrument does not move as is from New York to Mumbai.
I don't know, man. I love your comment. It's so brilliant. Does it not transform? Does finance not
Neither
transform?
does journalism transform. Like I'm trying to draw some kind of parallel between journalism and
I hear what you're saying. I totally get it. I catch it's a really beautiful thought. And I don't agree. I don't agree that finance is autonomous of geography and politics. Why? Because if you're in Bangalore, don't know anything about Bangalore, although I had my roommate for 3 years in college was from Bangalore anyway, but still have never been. Have you? Is that where you're from?
neither am I.
Oh, good. Cool. I love dosa, but I think, let's not take Bangalore. Let's take New York and New Jersey. Better. If you live in New York and you want to trade a stock, you have a distance on your fiber optic cable. You know this story. You know. If you're in New Jersey, you have a long distance in your cable. So, do you know what they had to do? Does everybody know what they had to do? So had to buy a fiber optic cable that was wrapped around a coil to slow their trades down. Do you know this? So because you were sitting in New York and you would be sending something to the New York Stock Exchange as a bid, you were always there first, before the guy in New Jersey, right? But they had to wind the cable up to slow you down, right? What happens if you're in Bangalore? You know, they're not going to wind your cable in New York to the distance of a cable to get to Bangalore. What I'm saying is, if you're going to trade on the New York Stock Exchange, there's a material regional difference, right? But if you're going to trade on the Bangalore Stock Exchange, the roles are reversed, right? What are they? That's my question. Can New York,
with the thermostat metaphor,
Yeah.
or the comparison of its actual working,
yeah,
it is still a question of, just take the New York, New Jersey example.
yeah,
Really comes down to matter
yep,
that makes what you're arguing possible.
yep,
But the structuring of the instrument doesn't change. You also explained how
uh-huh,
the
Does the thermostat change?
derivatives were,
yep, yep,
it came about.
Yep.
How did they just think of something that absurd in terms of a financial instrument?
yep.
That instrument moved to Bangalore as is.
And you're saying that there was that didn't?
As is. No difference.
Wait, which one?
Monsoon climate,
Yeah.
everything's different,
Yeah.
but the
If I guess-
speculation on
You want to talk about abstraction? You want to talk about abstraction?
yeah.
Let's do that. I actually love that, because you might very well then say that there needs to be a modernism that we relate to finance. That maybe finance achieved an escape velocity from the material world that we in architecture will never be able to catch up to. Which is to say that there's a kind of conceptual, if you will, sort of nirvana of finance, which produced an autonomous instrument irregardless of its material circumstances, because it was purely speculative and purely fictional. And why isn't there such a abstraction in architecture? And because it's so goddamn material, right?
Or what is the problem of architectural abstraction?
I would say that I think the problem is that it's a commitment, I think, on my part, and maybe this is my politics, as something of a Marxist as well, that that those abstractions that finance has found, I would disagree about, let's say, medicine and journalism, because I think those are pretty material practices. But it is exactly the abstraction of finance, which I think I find architecture an antidote to. That it can deal with abstraction, but always also finds a material substrate for that abstraction. I love that about architecture. It's what makes me feel comfortable dealing with it. As opposed, and why I would never, listen, I spent one whole summer.
Modes of practice.
Yeah, I spent one whole summer working in Bankers Trust in the, what was it called? Global Risk Management. They invented the derivative, right? I spent the whole summer there working for Tom Dalla, who explained to me how great this goddamn thing was. And at the end of the summer, I'd done a summer program in architecture and a summer program internship at Global Risk Management at Bankers Trust. I realized there was definitely no decision to be made. It was clear to me that one form of abstraction was corrupt because it never came back down to earth, and its politics were about creating a buffer between itself and the world. And the other, architecture, which in its broken barely capable of mustering any kind of intelligence by comparison, was still something I believed in, right? It was still something I could get on board with. That other thing that looked horrible, right? So, I mean, in a city like this, or in the city that I grew up in New York, where, and I'm imagining like the intrusion of bankers here as Brexit is, imminent. Like, surely, 100,000 millionaires sort of waiting to join raise your rents. I'm like, let's do something else. Yeah. But that was a great question too. Yeah. Why can we never be financed? Because we don't want to be.
That was wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.